the impacts of climate change on our health, and that's just one of those planetary systems where that connection is found. And then, because the information is really heavy, I'm going to try to end on a little bit of a positive note in understanding why this is such an important area for us to all focus on and move forward with courage and strength to really make positive change, because it is indeed the greatest health opportunity we face in the 21st century. So we all can understand why the fundamentals of human health and well-being are simply access to clean air, clean water, nourishing food, a biologically diverse ecosystem, and also a safe and livable climate. These ecosystem services are delivered and maintained as part of a complex balance of biogeochemical systems on Earth. But we also know that recent decades of human progress that's been really positive for the most part in terms of the public health benefits that have been achieved, have also destabilised many of these systems. And this is something that's now risking the health of both current and future populations. To help better understand and articulate this interface, the area of planetary health has been born. And that's really just the study of the relationship of human health and these natural systems on which we depend. Associated with that, there have been identified 9 major planetary boundaries or critical areas of this interface, and you can see that on the right-hand side of the screen. And that interface, or those critical areas, what's really important is this understanding of safe operating areas, or areas in which we need to maintain a certain balance in order to safeguard human health. So those areas, again, are on the screen, but they're climate change, biodiversity loss, ocean acidification, ozone depletion, atmospheric ozone pollution, freshwater use, biogeochemical flows of nitrogen and phosphorus, land system changes, and the release of novel chemicals. What you can also appreciate on the slide there is those areas that are in red: biodiversity, flows of nitrogen and phosphorus, and climate change. So those areas, land conservation, those areas are already outside those safe operating zones, and they pose very real and very present dangers. So I am going to go on to talk simply on climate change, but it's really important that those other areas of boundaries are identified and explored. Before I go on to climate change, because I'm not one to miss an opportunity, I just wanted to briefly talk about biodiversity. So biodiversity is simply biological variety in all of its forms. And indeed, as I said before, a rich and diverse ecosystem on our planet, those biodiversity factors are really the foundations of those things that were fundamental to us: clean air, fresh water, food security. It's also a vital source of our medicines. It assists in limiting disease, and it's an essential part of what stabilises the climate. As you can see by some of those figures on the slide, we are rapidly seeing a decline in our biodiversity, most of which is due to human activity, such as the rapid expansion of human land use, mostly for agricultural purposes, and more recently, the impacts of climate change itself. Frighteningly, we're now entering what many are terming the 6th mass extinction. But what we don't really appreciate or understand is how this is going to change or lead to changes in morbidity and mortality for us. We also don't really understand that point of what we call no return, or that tipping point, where if enough vital pieces in the puzzle are removed, we'll have mass ecological collapse. I don't have time to cover it in detail. There's a link at the bottom of the slide there to go on to from the World Health Organization that looks in more detail at that biodiversity health link. But I think it's something that we all need to start to recognise a little bit more as well. So moving on to climate change. Now, again, I don't have time to cover the science, but we do understand that the evidence is irrefutable that human emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, in addition to the impacts of deforestation and agricultural practices, are resulting in rapidly increasing levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which in turn is resulting in rising global temperatures, altered precipitation rates, and climate change. So this is creating ecological, physical, and health impacts, including extreme weather events, sea level rise, altered crop growth, and disruption to water systems, among others. It impacts both the social and environmental determinants of health, so that clean air, safe drinking water, sufficient food, shelter, and the complex systems that allow our communities and our societies to thrive. So also, if you remember back to that slide on those planetary boundaries, we have stepped outside that safe operating zone for human society. And current predictions, even with international commitments to emission reductions being achieved, are still predicting degrees of greater than 2 to 3 degrees Celsius of warming by 2021. So given the extent and significance of this impact, climate change presents one of the world's most pressing challenges. Such is the threat that this actually poses to human health that it's been described by the Lancet Medical Journal as the greatest threat to health of the 21st century. And the World Health Organization, along with a number of other international bodies and the Australian Medical Association, have actually gone on to declare a climate health emergency. It's also, again, not a future risk. This is a now risk, and hundreds of thousands of people are already experiencing the health impacts. There is a very real threat of future irreversible harm, and it's led international organisations, and you can see words by the World Health Organization. They're saying that this is an urgent and prioritised need, and we need to come together to form solutions to this wicked problem. What I also want to take the opportunity to stress is that a person's vulnerability to climate change is not equal. Just as many other things, it depends on geographical, social, economic, and biological factors. So what we know is that climate change is a threat multiplier, and it compounds and exacerbates existing inequalities. The people with fewer material, social, and health resources, and those who have likely contributed least to its occurrence, are those who are most impacted. I really want to take the time again to articulate the disproportionate impact it will have on our youth and our future generations, so those that are unborn, and also to our Indigenous Australians, who, when faced with impacts from ongoing dispossession, loss of access to traditional lands, waters, and natural resources, will see further inequality, will experience further inequality. So it's really important that we bed this discussion down not only as a health issue, but also one of justice. So now looking at the health impacts of climate change, and what a really easy way to do is to break it down into 3 main areas. So direct impacts, the morbidity and mortality related to exposure to extreme weather events, higher temperatures and heat waves. Indirect impacts, so those mediated by the systems that give us air quality, water quality, changes in food production, and infectious disease patterns and vectors. And then the social impacts. So that's the health implications experienced from social change, such as civil unrest, forced migration, and the economic hardships that we will see as a result of climate change. So I'm going to go on and to discuss these areas a little bit more now. So I'll start with the direct impacts. This is a huge topic, so I'm going to try to really solidify it down into a few statements, but please, I encourage everyone to go away and do a little bit more reading after you've heard just these brief points. We know that the impacts of increased temperature will be felt not only through increased severity and frequency of heat waves, but also simply through increased experience of hot days. And you can see some of those experiences on the slide today, and this slide is from the World Health Organization. So not only do you have the direct implications of heat-related illness, such as heat stress, dehydration, heat stroke, but we'll also see quite significant exacerbation of pre-existing medical conditions, so cardiovascular, respiratory, and renal, to name a few. These impacts, importantly, will not only be on those days of direct heat, but also in the days to follow. So it's quite significant, the impacts that a single day or a number of days will present. Those at greatest risk, again, are those over the age of 65, those who have pre-existing medical conditions, or those who are vulnerable to exposure, so homeless, for example, or those with mental health conditions. Heat's actually been coined as the silent killer in Australia, and more people have died from extreme heat events than from all of the other naturally occurring hazards combined. So that's floods, tropical cyclones and bushfires. There's some really good research out of the ANU that estimates about 2% or around 3,000 deaths per annum between 2006 and 2017 were actually attributable to heat. It's expected that this, with climate change, will have a doubling of heat-related deaths over the next 40 years, and that's simply because of the increased frequency, duration and intensity of heat waves. Globally, the World Health Organization estimates that the annual mortality to heat will be greater than 92,000 by 2030 and greater than 250,000 by 2050. So they're massive numbers. Additional to this, as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen there are also the impacts that are mediated through the effects of heat on health service delivery. There's also effects on food and water-borne diseases, as well as disruption to social services and infrastructure. Looking at direct impacts through extreme weather events, many of you may remember those two images on the slides today. I think the top one, especially so, is burnt into the minds of most of Australians not too many months ago. So we see extreme weather events such as severe and frequent bushfires, floods and storms impacting health through direct injuries and deaths, such as exposure to fire through burns, drownings from flooding, increased infectious disease transmission that happens post-event, exposure to pollutants, and the impact of water and food supply. There's also socio-economic impacts, so loss of infrastructure, sometimes whole towns and cities, again, thinking back to those fires, as well as displaced people and the disturbances to our economy and everyone's in those communities' livelihoods. There's also quite significant evidence in and around the impacts on mental health. So these events are quite extreme, and indeed they're events that are perpetuated through time. So we see a lot of these impacts, not only in the days and weeks, but also months to years following these extreme events. Looking more closely at one such event and going back to those bushfires from 2019-2020, this is a slide from the MGA that looked at the health implications of those bushfires and particularly the bushfire smoke. So you can see on this slide that there was around just over 30 direct fire-related deaths, but there was an additional 417 deaths due to bushfire smoke. There was also 1,300 ED presentations for exacerbation of asthma and over 3,000 hospital admissions for cardiovascular and respiratory disease. Significant numbers when you imagine that the health services in which these people were presenting were already stressed due to the fire events. Outside of this slide, but also important to understand, was the exacerbation of other diseases. So those members of the community who couldn't access health services, so non-communicable disease exacerbation, as well as the mental health impacts from exposure to trauma. And also something that we're seeing the data coming out for was the impacts on undelivered children, so the low delivery weights that were resulting from mothers exposed to high levels of bushfire smoke during pregnancy. So I'm going to quickly touch on the indirect impacts now. So those mediated by water, air, food and vector distribution. So the impact, the sources of air pollution linked to climate change and their impacts are quite, well, they're starting to be more and more understood. So chronic exposure to air pollution, especially from the burning of coal and fossil fuels, can cause exacerbation of lung disease, cardiovascular disease, and that's both heart disease as well as stroke, cancer, pregnancy. There are pregnancy complications, again, looking at that incidence of low birth weight babies. And such is the extent of these health impacts that globally exposure to air pollution is linked to around 7 to 8 million deaths, premature deaths a year. That's an astounding 1 in 5 deaths worldwide. So that's a huge number. Also, we know that elevated levels of urban ozone that are experienced as a result of heat waves can cause difficulty breathing and coughing, increased susceptibility to pulmonary infections or lung infections, and it can aggravate pre-existing lung disease such as asthma, COPD, and bronchitis. We also know that climate change is going to increase the exposure to mould as a result of more frequent and more severe weather events. And this will, of course, exacerbate pre-existing respiratory disease as well. And that stronger winds and drying conditions will cause increased risk of dust storms, especially to those in rural and remote communities, again, exacerbating pre-existing respiratory and ENT conditions. Climate, importantly, also plays a large role in the production and distribution of allergens and airborne pollens. So this is particularly relevant in Australia because of the prevalence of allergic disease and asthma. We've got some of the highest rates in the world, so something that's going to be quite significant and profound in our communities. Moving on to water quality or water security. With changing precipitation rates, we're going to see increasing drought events, which is going to impact water security. And Australia is particularly at risk of this, especially in our rural and remote communities and our Aboriginal rural communities particularly so. So what we also understand is that extreme events such as bushfires and flooding increase contamination of our waters. So with debris, smoke, pollution, and stormwater. So human waste and animal waste is moving into waterways and contaminating drinking or water supplies, and that contributes quite significantly to infectious disease burden and obviously the human health risks that are implicated as part of that. The increased temperatures, and especially with stagnant waters, will also favour pathogen proliferation and again lead to increased diarrheal disease. So, for example, Campylobacter, cholera, harmful algal blooms, and salmonella. Moving on to food security, and you can see on this slide there the interactions with which climate change will impact food production. So changing fresh water, viable land changes, and increased risks of spoilage are related to increased temperatures and increased precipitation will impact food availability and obviously result in food scarcity. Also, something that's we're seeing is that rising carbon dioxide levels actually changes the nutritional profile of our staple crops. So food is not only more difficult to produce or more scarce, but it's less nutritious. And this indeed will impact those most vulnerable, so those in developing nations more than those in other nations. We know that nutrition is one of the most effective ways to decrease the burden of many diseases and their associated factors. And so what we're going to see is that access to good nutritious food will become less so, and so food will be less available and less affordable. And this will significantly contribute, again, to the physical and mental health of those that experience food scarcity. So it's a worldwide problem. Moving on to vector distribution. Apologies that this slide is quite a lot to take in, that image on the right. But essentially, what we'll see is that increasing temperatures and changing precipitation rates are going to increase the exposure risk to many diseases that are spread by vectors. So it will increase the range of these vectors and their breeding durations. So things like arbovirus, malaria, dengue fever, yellow fever, Zika virus, Ross River fever, and many others. So in just one example, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change predicted that in 2050, because of increasing range for the mosquito that helps harbour and spread malaria, as it moves into previously unexposed areas, we could see up to a 50% higher probability of malarial cases worldwide. So that's quite significant. We're also going to see many diseases not previously seen in places in Australia move down and move out, putting more people at risk. Additional to this, with climate change changing the habitat of our species, and also with human activity causing loss of habitat for our wildlife, we're going to see an increased interface of that human wilderness animal area, which again we know predicts we should expect new species interactions and increased exposure to both existing but also new or novel zoonotic diseases. Moving on now to those social impacts. So I've weaved a story to date that starts to touch on those climate change impacts to the social determinants of health. So those in and around our economy, our resources, our livelihoods. And indeed, the 2018 report of the Lancet Countdown tallied these economic losses associated with climate change related events just in the year 2017 to something in the order of $326 billion US. $326 billion US dollars. Now, 99% of that occurred in low-income countries and were experienced by those without insurance. So again, the harm felt most by those already vulnerable. So we know climate change is also a threat, risk, or force multiplier for violent conflicts and fragile states. So mostly as a result of resource scarcity, forced displacement. So what we're going to see is that increased civil unrest and the forced migration that comes with that. And again, I articulate this isn't a future risk. So there's numbers out, 22.5 million people displaced annually as a result of weather-related natural disasters already. Now, as you can see on that slide on the screen now, this is also not an other world problem. This is an Australian problem. So, for example, those summer fires of 2019 to 2020 saw whole communities destroyed by those fires, forced relocation of many families and communities, and they are indeed our own climate refugees. So this is, again, not just something that we're going to see in other places. Spanning across all of those areas and beyond those areas are the mental health implications, and these are quite significant, quite profound. So be it simply the increasing unrest or that sense of loss that many are now experiencing as we face climate change, that so-called solesthesia. This is something that we're especially seeing in the young and also First Nations individuals as they're watching with increased senses of despair that the world around them change. But it's also the mental health impacts of heat exposure, and you can see some figures up there in regards to worsening or increasing hospital admissions due to psychological distress associated with heat events. And also what's important to articulate is that the increased heat-related morbidity and mortality experienced by those with pre-existing mental health condition. So more likely to be homeless or socio-economically disadvantaged, plus these physiological impacts of psychiatric medications and often a decreased ability to identify or undertake adaptive behaviours, we see quite profound increases in morbidity and mortality in these populations during heat-related events and also extreme weather events. You can also see there that these extreme weather events are actually precipitants of mental health conditions or negative mental health outcomes in their own right. So 25 to 50% of people experiencing these extreme weather events do go on to demonstrate negative mental health as a result, and this is quite much more significant in children. So, for example, the Canberra bushfires a few years ago demonstrated that up to 50% of children 6 months post that event had markers of PTSD. And I'll just quickly touch on that topic of the prolonged extreme event exposure. So, for example, droughts, and this is strongly linked with increasing risk of mental health and suicide, especially in areas dependent on agriculture. So one study out from New South Wales demonstrated that around 9% of deaths in males 30 to 49 years of age were from drought-related suicide. So that's quite profound. I'm going to finish up because that's pretty heavy with some positive thoughts. So leave you with some hope, and that's, I guess, in our role in the health sector, as a pivotal position, or having a pivotal role in this response to this health emergency. So we know that as people who work in the health industry, we're stewards of health. So we don't own health. We simply help, I guess, we have a duty of care and a responsibility to provide the best that we can in terms of health and well-being to both our individual patients and also the community. Now, we know that we have the power to influence, and we have resources and responsibility to use those resources, and that we as a group are trusted members of the community. So we have the power of the health voice to not only translate the science and articulate the health risks, but be part of and actually lead cross-sector and interdisciplinary discussions that can occur to tackle climate change. What we also know is that it's the greatest health opportunity that we have in the 21st century. So many of those things that have the potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions also produce major health co-benefits. For example, cleaner energy. So we'll see reduction in emissions that will result in decreased household air pollution and then a decrease in those deaths related to pollution exposure. But that can also be articulated or demonstrated in things such as public health, public transport, as well as large plant-rich diets or decreased animal product in our diets, and also things like exposure to green spaces, so reforestation and good urban planning. And I'm going to leave it there today. I've probably gone over time. Apologies if I have. Thank you again. I'll stop sharing.
Thanks so much, Emily, and I'm glad that you gave us some hopefulness at the end, but you certainly set out the cases to why we need to act and take action, globally as well as in our individual health services. So thank you very much for that presentation. I'd like to move on now and welcome Dr. Nick Watts, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer of the National Health Service and is responsible for its commitment to deliver a world-class net zero emission health service. Based in London, he leads the Greener NHS team across the country, which focuses on improving the health of patients and the public through a robust and accelerated response to climate change and the broader sustainability agenda. Prior to the National Health Service, Nick worked internationally as the Executive Director of the Lancet Countdown and the Lancet Commission on Health and Climate Change, which is a collaboration of UN agencies and academic centres across the world. He's also focused on engaging the health profession on the links between public health and climate change, having founded both the Global Climate and Health Alliance and the UK Health Alliance on Climate Change. Nick is no stranger to Western Australia, having studied medicine at the University of Western Australia and having worked at some of our biggest hospitals, including Fiona Stanley, Fremantle and Sir Charles Gardner during his career. And just a reminder, if you have any questions for Nick, please send them during his talk in the chat, as he has to leave not long after his session. So welcome to Nick, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you. Apologies if I sound a little sleepy. It was a late night last night. There's plenty happening in British politics at the moment, and a bit of an early morning. I don't have to apologise for the first time in a very long time for my accent. Normally I have to apologise for my accent to every British, French, German audience I speak to. They often have subtitles underneath me. Look, I'll pull some slides up. There's some pretty pictures, hey? They don't say an enormous amount that you guys don't already know. I'm going to talk about three things. Why the NHS might care about climate change, why we might have the commitments we do have, what on earth those commitments are, what they mean in the context of something like the NHS, right? It's a big healthcare system, 1.3 million staff, the fifth largest employer in the world, budget of about £130 billion a year. Why, what, and how? Some of the problems with sustainability, with the response to climate change, if you're not careful, you spend a lot of time talking about, thinking about talking. This stuff becomes real when you get down to something tangible. Doesn't matter how big, doesn't matter how small. But I'm going to talk about some of the hopefully tangible things that the NHS is doing. So the why is very, very simple. That was what the terrifying previous 30 minutes was about. Why? because the point of the NHS, 1.3 million staff, the point of the NHS is to deliver high quality care for all now and for future generations. World's first universal healthcare system, free at point of access, very, very similar in structure, very, very similar in sort of funding nature to Australia. You just can't do it. You cannot run the NHS through to 2050 unless you respond to climate change. Not possible. Not possible because we know that we expect a 6-fold increase in extreme weather events across the United Kingdom, both in their intensity and a doubling of the standard deviation of their duration up to 2030. Now that's not 20, 50 years away. It's only 9 years away. Super close. We know that 12% of NHS facilities are currently in high-risk flood zones. That's just because we live in the United Kingdom. It floods here. That's fine. We're ready for that. What we're not ready for is 2035, where we expect that number to double as a result of climate change. We also know that we're a part of that problem, right? So in total, the NHS, a very, very large employer, 5% of UK emissions, roughly the size of the entire country of Denmark or Croatia. We are responsible for about 40% of public sector energy consumption in the country. So we're nowhere a big part of the problem. The other reason we care about it is we've had a decent crack at it. So I'm new to the NHS, but the NHS has cared deeply for about 10 years, reduced its emissions well ahead of the Climate Change Act, depending on where you draw the boundaries of a healthcare system, and you can discuss that for decades. Somewhere around 30–40% reduction. All the official numbers are public somewhere. As the NHS has reduced its emissions, it has managed to save money. It's managed to save a couple of £100 million in total over the course of the decade. As the NHS has reduced its emissions, it has managed to save lives. On average, we think about 800, 900 lives a year, mostly air pollution improvements, mostly around some of our hospitals, around our clinics where populations are most vulnerable. Why would the NHS care about climate change? Because of those impacts, because we know that it's possible and positive. And perhaps the most important, we're a big healthcare system. Any healthcare system, it relies, if it's going to run successfully, it relies, everyone here knows, on its staff, on the nurses, on the physios, the pharmacists, the clinicians, the doctors, who run the damn thing. Every single year we go out and we ask our staff, we ask NHS employees, what do you want to see the NHS do more of? Every single year they shout back, we want to see the NHS act in a more environmentally sustainable way. We just finished some polling actually, 9 out of 10 NHS staff want to see the NHS meet its net zero commitments. What's really exciting is 8 out of 10 think that the pandemic that we're going through right now is either no reason to slow down or is a reason to accelerate the work that we're doing. No one is telling us to go slower. That's the why. This is the what. So look, those planetary boundaries there, terrifying, 7, 8, 9 of them. The NHS, we attempt to act on all of them. I'm going to focus primarily on our carbon targets, on our climate change targets. And the reason for that is I like a good enemy. It's nice to have something you are focused on, that you can quantify, that you can count day after day after day, report publicly. And if you meet your targets, people can clap. And if you don't meet your targets, you can get a slap on the wrist. And God, that's great. It's so great to see the NHS start to get in trouble for not reducing its emissions enough. So our targets are simple. Net zero by 2040 for the emissions we control directly. Something called scope 1 and 2 and a little bit of scope 3 for the sake of international comparison. Net zero for absolutely everything you can imagine. Scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Don't worry about the scopes. They're just a way of dividing things up so that we can compete with the Kiwis and the French. Absolutely everything by 2045. So 2 targets split based on what we control directly and what we don't control, but we know that we have the ability to influence. So those broader targets, think GSK. We're a big purchaser from GSK. We know that we don't have the ability to control where their emissions come from in their factories, but we also know that we're such a big purchaser that when we went to them at the start of this year and said, hey, we're really serious about this net zero work, they said, yeah, okay, we could be serious with you, and shifted some of their production so that the medicines they're providing us already are aligned with our targets, and in the next 2 years, the medicines that they provide the rest of the world will start to align as well. Those are the emissions that we influence. It's the why and the what, and I'm going to try and go quickly and end so that we can have a little bit of time for some proper questions, because I think that's maybe where the more interesting side of this comes. The how is tricky, right? The how is tricky because, like I said, if you're not careful, you end up talking about talking and not necessarily doing that much. And I think one of the key things we have to get right as health professionals working on climate change, we have to demonstrate that this stuff is possible, and we have to demonstrate that this stuff is positive. We have to do it again and again. It doesn't matter how big you start, you just have to get something. Start on day 1, repeat it day 2, expand a little day 3, take a break day 4, start again day 5. So the kinds of things the NHS is doing. Firstly, we're building out our infrastructure. No longer a team of 4 or 5. We used to be an impressive team, the Sustainable Development Unit, 4 or 5 staff based out in Cambridge, really kicking ass, doing some really impressive things. There's a step change that's happened, probably in the last 6 months or so. Now about a team of 150 scattered out across the entire system. That doesn't include all of the sustainability professionals in every trust. So in total, the number of people employed in the NHS working on climate change, somewhere in the realm of sort of 1,500 or so, centrally working on it. 150, pulling together anything from new net zero hospital standards to new procurement standards for the NHS to innovation competitions for the world's first zero emission ambulance. Getting that infrastructure right, I think, is one of the core pieces of work that we're pulling together. Importantly, run through our NHS Sustainability Board. That board reports publicly to the National Board and to the Secretary of State for Health. What you will see when you look at it is, yes, sustainability people chair that board, but the people there are not sustainability people. The people there are the Deputy Director for Nursing for the NHS. The people there are the Chief Allied Health Professional Officer. They are the Director of Estates, the Director of Commercial Medicines. They are people that hold buckets of carbon scattered across the NHS. Because ultimately, the purpose of this team, that 150 and the 1,500, is to make ourselves obsolete, is to embed this the whole way through the system such that you no longer need some of these people here, because it's just core practice. It's just core to what the NHS does. So the kinds of things we're working on, that sustainability board and that team of people. Maybe let's talk about the estate. So the new estate and the old estate, we have a couple of 100 hospitals across the system. They are old, they've been around for a little while. They could use a little bit of a refresh. And so working closely with number 10, we have about £250 million in year 1, hoping to continue that trend forward to decarbonise the NHS estate. Gets you most of the way there, most of what you want to do. Doesn't get you all of the way there, but that's okay, we're just getting started. That allows you to decarbonise the estate by somewhere around 65, 66 kilotons of CO2e. Bit of a meaningless number, very, very roughly 2-3 million flights a year from London to Perth. Then we have our new estate, 40 new hospitals that the NHS is building, scattered across the country. We hope we are going to have in time the world's first net zero hospital standard. A new standard, a very, very long document. The first draft, I think, is 800-900 pages, way too long. It gives you a good sense of what we mean when we say a net zero hospital. Yes, the materials, yes, low carbon, zero carbon concrete, steel, some of that good cutting edge stuff. Yes, modular, yes, digital first. But really far more interesting, I suppose, is how you look at the models of care, how clinical work changes within those new hospitals. you start to see, 3/5 of outpatient appointments occurring remotely, and an extra fifth of them occurring close to home, right next to where the patient lives. We are looking very, very seriously at shifting that model of care so that people aren't coming back and forth from a tertiary centre like that, where we're getting a little closer to where our patients are. That's the estate. Obviously, there's the transport question, how we move our staff, our patients, visitors to and from and around. We are responsible, I think, for roughly 1 in 20 cars on the road in the United Kingdom. Pretty big number, which I guess comes with the territory of being such a big part of the economy. It's Tuesday, just out yesterday, the NHS has just shifted all of our contracts for our non-emergency patient transport system. 12 million miles every year, how we move patients to and from dialysis appointments, how we move them between different NHS facilities. We've shifted all of those contracts. We've given fair warning to everyone we purchase from. We expect them to be net zero in their fleets, 100% electric, and we expect them to get there pretty damn quickly. At the very, very earliest, 8 years from now, at the very, very latest, 12 years from now. Points for people that get there earlier, and by points I mean preferential contracts. We will start to put that out through all of the NHS's transport contracts over the next 6 to 12 months. That stuff's easy. The easy stuff is where we know the technology is there. There's absolutely no question. Give it, 12 months, 24 months. Electric vehicles are already cheaper than their non-electric counterparts. If purchased new, the average price is about to drop to parity in about 24 months. So we're not worried about the technology for that. What we are worried about the technology for is ambulances. We have a couple of thousand, but that's not quite enough to wake Ford's factories up in the morning or Mercedes factories up in the morning where our ambulances come from. And so we're running an innovation competition. We have Ford, we have Mercedes, we have a couple of other new entrants you might not have heard of, working with us to produce a whole range of different zero emission ambulances. We have fully hydrogen ambulances in the works. We have an electric ambulance with a hydrogen range extender, which we use for some of our rural and remote parts of the country, not quite rural and remote as Western Australia might have to contend with. I went and physically kicked a tire on one of those a week or two ago. We're going to have it up, ready to run and ready to be driven around the UN Climate Summit in Glasgow this November. They're already on the road. They're already being tested. And we have all of our plans in place to get that charging infrastructure out across every ambulance station in the country over the next couple of years. All those sorts of things. And much, much, much more. Strong, angry, look at our face, we're serious, goddammit, commitments. Within the decade, the NHS will no longer purchase from anyone that does not meet or exceed our commitments on climate change, our commitments on net zero. Caused quite a stir amongst our suppliers. We had a lot of discussions over the last 9 months, a lot of engagement. Surely you can't be serious. Absolutely we are. Go and look at your competitors. It turns out they're already working with us very, very quickly. People have started to align with those commitments, partly because of our size, partly because I think people can see the writing on the wall. This is the direction that the economy is heading, not just in the United Kingdom, but across the world. If you're not compliant with net zero, you're going to be left behind. And that's almost not a question that we're asking anymore. The question is just, to what standard, verified how, which we can work through. I'm going to stop there. One final slide. I mentioned those 8 out of 10 respondents when we go out and ask our staff, what do you think about the NHS working on this in the middle of COVID? I ask that question every now and then. Initially, it was a genuine question. Now it's just because I quite like the response. First time I asked it was to the board of the NHS privately, 12 months ago. Should we really be doing this? Do you want to delay the net zero strategy? All of the work we're doing because of COVID, is now the right time? And the response overwhelmingly, unanimously came from every member of the board. What the hell are you talking about? Climate crisis is a health crisis. The NHS absolutely cannot face one crisis and duck its responsibility for the other. We have the ability to take on two crises at the same time. It's nice to see that long-term commitment that is there persistently day after day. It's also nice to see the understanding of all of those links around some of the vulnerabilities that drive mortality from COVID-19 and how they relate to the vulnerabilities that drive mortality and morbidity from climate change, and how those inequalities pervade the whole way through, starting to make those connections in terms of how the NHS recovers from COVID-19 and how we respond to climate change. That's it. That's a why, a what, and a how. Hopefully straightforward enough. Thank you very, very much for having me.
That's fantastic, Nick. It's so incredible to see what the NHS is achieving, and even though we probably feel like we're a long way behind, but I also feel like we're catching up fast as well and following in your footsteps, and obviously learning from overseas experience. So that's fantastic. One of the questions that's come through on the chat is any advice for organisations that are smaller purchasers when it comes to liaising with industry and big companies? We're getting told that Australia is a small market when we ask companies to explore more environmentally and sound purchasing in anaesthetics.
They're lying to you. I get told that. I get told all the time, oh, the NHS is just a small part of the market. Nonsense. Bring it on. Why don't we see what happens when the NHS starts to move its business elsewhere because you're not compliant with net zero? I wouldn't listen to that for a second. A few reasons. Partly, you're not as small as someone might pretend. Partly, and perhaps most importantly, you're not alone. There is no doubt in my mind, none at all, that every single healthcare system is going to start to have its own net zero targets across the world, that this is the direction we are heading. The NHS was the first. Coming up very, very shortly after that was the Welsh healthcare system. The Scottish healthcare system, they've got their net zero targets coming out in half a second. I bet you it's going to be 2044 and 6 months or something like that, just ahead of where we are. The United States, new executive order out a month or two ago, creating a new health and climate change unit within HHS. Everyone is starting to look at this. Everyone is shifting their procurement practices. That doesn't quite answer, the question, because it's sort of a bit of posturing. I guess the other thing I would say is, look, some of this is a bit of stick, right? But some of this as well is working with some of these companies. We spend a lot of time engaging directly, with a couple of the guys that produce some of the anesthetics that we consume, trying to figure out how they can help us reduce our emissions. That engagement is genuine. That engagement is bolstered when we demonstrate that we're just going to start to move away from their product. I talked about GSK and Chiesi, two of the big pharmaceutical companies. The engagement we get from them is, fantastic. Only when you demonstrate, hey, we're pretty damn serious about this.
Yeah, so we're bigger than we think we are, especially when we combine together and use our collective bargaining power. And another question, can you share how the NHS has navigated funding requests for carbon reduction project when core health service budgets are already under significant pressure? How do you get that buy-in when the money is meant to be going to direct patient care all of the time?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack in that question, hey? Where to start? Okay. Firstly, how much is net zero going to cost the NHS in total? Don't know. I have a few estimates. It's in the sort of high single-digit billions over the course of a couple of years. What's the ROI on that investment? It pays back in half a split second. It's because a lot of the big costs are around energy efficiency for the estate. They are around insulation, heating, cooling efficiency. They are around making sure that when we move a patient or perform an operation, we do it in an efficient, clever, smart, sustainable way. So we know what the upfront investment costs are. We know that the ROI on those, I said half a second. Look, the average for what we want to do in the first 10 years is about 3 years and 6 months, about 3.5 years. We know the ROI is incredibly favorable, better than you would get, to be honest, in most other parts of the healthcare system. But the other thing we know, and this is really important, you can act on the vast majority of the NHS's emissions, of our healthcare system's emissions, without significant additional capital investment. About 85% you can act on. It's just that last little bit, it's just the expensive estate, but you can act on a heck of a lot of this stuff, reducing emissions just by shifting the way that we as individuals make our sort of day-by-day decisions, just by shifting policy regulations attached to that. So that's the first thing, right? It's not as expensive as I think sometimes we let ourselves believe or feel. The second thing is a lot of what you want to do, and Emily, you talked about this just before, a lot of what you want to do is good. It's good for public health. You go and look at all the things the Lancet Commission in 2015, 2009 said, hey, you should go and think seriously about. They don't look like climate change interventions. They look like healthier diets, more livable cities. They look like cleaner air, more efficient healthcare systems. So we actually find a lot of our priorities, there isn't that dichotomy of, you know, patient care versus response to climate change. They're just the same thing. There are going to be points where, you know, where that isn't true, right? So number one, it doesn't cost that much, but it will cost a little bit. Number two, where it does cost something, for the most part, you can align it pretty perfectly with your existing priorities. But there is going to be something left over at the end. And that isn't for the healthcare service to fund. There, for the most part, a lot of the funding that we work with, once we've exhausted those two areas, for the most part, that comes from climate change funding across the country, not from the existing health budget, if that makes sense.
It's also about taking a longer term view rather than just the next budget cycle as well, that it's not going to necessarily come back to you immediately, but it's over the longer term.
That's right. And I take the non-emergency patient transport contracts I was talking about just before, right? Yes, a little bit more expensive up front. Those electric vehicles, they run about twice as long. On average, the car that we purchase in the NHS, if it's diesel, we can keep it for about 2.5 years because we run them hard. If it's an electric vehicle, we reckon we can keep them for about double that. And that's what our experience tells us so far. And they run at almost zero cost. It's cheaper for us if you take a 5-year view to run our transport system electric than it is to run it diesel. That's not in 2040, that's in 2021.
You talked about $250 million a year to decarbonise buildings. Given that there are so many older hospitals in the UK and we have our fair share in Australia, how are you going about doing that? What are the actual physical changes that are being made, and what are your targets? What are you aiming at there?
Sure. How are we doing that? Importantly, for the most part, we are putting the power to run that in the hands of the trusts, in the hands of the individual hospitals, because they have a better sense of how they want to decarbonise their estate. We are also working closely with them to make sure that as they do that, this funding is synergised with existing improvements. If someone is already building a new wing of their hospital, fantastic. Why don't we combine these together and make sure that's a net zero wing, right? Because we want to make sure that a lot of this work is directly related, is sort of, you know, one in one with the existing priorities of that trust. The sorts of things you might look at, it's boring, to be honest. I could talk for far too long about LED lights. There is absolutely no good reason why any hospital in the United Kingdom isn't run entirely on LED lights. There just isn't a good reason to do that, to not do that. We're working on it. That's some of the early stuff we'll get to. It's just so much cheaper, so much more efficient. Some of it is, how do you heat the building? How do you cool the building? Every now and then we have that problem here, not that often. Dirty secret, we have 2 hospitals up in the north of England. Don't tell anyone, we're going to get rid of it by the end of the year. But 2 hospitals up in the north of England whose heating is powered by coal. It's an old historic thing, we're getting rid of it. Got some nice solar panels coming into the roofs and some of the green space around. Changing some of the ways that we power our grid, making sure that we have the charging infrastructure in place ready for those transport systems, making sure that the hospitals are properly insulated. really simple, really boring things like that. A lot of the time when you talk about decarbonising the estate, it's some of the best stuff to do because the ROI, the return on investment, is just so fantastic. It's also some of the most boring stuff to talk about because people fall asleep when you talk about lighting and heating and, you know, insulation.
Yeah, but they're also the practical things as well. So they're the real grassroots things, which is great. Another question here from one of our health promotion team. Can you share what preventative health initiatives the NHS is undertaking, including but not limited to active transport for staff, visitors and patients? And also, can you speak to what food waste initiatives are currently being implemented, especially during the pandemic?
Oh, food waste. I've recently come across aerobic biodigesters as a concept, and I am blown away by what seems to be a magic hole where you put large amounts of food and out the other side you broadly get a little bit of gas and liquid. We are trialing some of those out across 14 sites in the NHS, shifting the way that we manage all of our food waste. The pilots we have at the moment, they won't need initial investment because if it works for us, and we think it will, they're just cheaper than the way that we currently run our food waste. They reduce the emissions of that because we capture the gas and we use it, we sell it for the most part offsite. The other side of that, though, is getting a little bit more efficient with how we distribute food out. And so we are pulling together national regulations for sort of new hospital food standards. What kind of food are you serving in a hospital, who you're serving it to. We don't know a lot of that. There's not a lot standardized across the system. And so step one, digitize the menu, digitize the way that we deliver a lot of the food. A lot of that, I think, is my experience in Western Australia is broadly done. Perhaps not as sophisticated as you might want it to be, but more sophisticated than what we have over in the NHS. So we're working on a bit of that. Then we're going to start to have conversations about decarbonising. Once you have those standards, then we can start to sort of tweak left and right, see what people notice, see what impacts it has on the kinds of food that we are serving to patients, to staff. A fun little add on to that, at the end of the week, the NHS has a Chef of the Year program. It's sort of attached to, you know, Great British Bake Off, etc., etc. The finals for that are coming up the end of the week. We have a nice little add-on, a plant forward sort of meal that chefs are producing, which is part of the competition that they'll finish up on Friday. It's going to be good fun. I answered the first part of the question. What was the second part of the question? What was the first part?
The first part was about initiatives around active transport for staff, visitors and patients, so that, you know, reducing your emissions by reducing the travel or making it more efficient. Yeah,
sure. So a couple of sensible ways, and this is something where our staff are pretty passionate about, you can imagine, which is great. Couple of sensible ways, right? It's partly about, do you have the infrastructure in place? Do you have the you know, showers? Do you have the cycle storage, etc.? It's partly, are we including some of that stuff into our salary sacrifices? On the second of those, we are. On the first of those, we are looking for funding at the moment. The NHS can't do anything unless it's big, because the NHS is big. So every time you want to, you know, change something for one hospital, it ends up costing, you know, 50, 60, 70 million pounds, just by its size. We do have, and this is something that our Chief Allied Health Professional Officer is leading. She's an occupational therapist and her deputy is a physio. They are leading a campaign, Get Active, mostly directed at our staff, to be honest, but part staff, part patient engagement. That, if you go and read the subtext or the second sentence, they're doing because they care about net zero and they think this is something where they can uniquely access. There is an interesting divide in the United Kingdom between direct delivery of healthcare, what the NHS does, and preventative services, which is shifting at the moment. It's coming, a lot of it is actually coming to the NHS to deal with, but previously has existed elsewhere, for example, in something called Public Health England. As it comes closer, I think we will start to do more and more, we hope, on that.
And just on that behaviour change, here I'm just speaking from South Metropolitan Health Service. During the height of COVID here, which obviously didn't reach the heights that it quite did in the UK, our digital outpatients went through the roof. Our clinicians switched over and off they went, and it was hugely successful. Post-COVID, it's almost gone back to where it was, and keeping those clinicians engaged has been a challenge. Do you use a carrot or a stick, or how do you, or have you managed to keep those sort of digital outpatients and digital appointments as part of business as usual?
Yeah. So listen, we are probably a couple of steps behind you in that, you know, we haven't come out of it yet, and so we still feel like, you know, the pandemic started 18 months ago and we're very much still in the middle of it. So the NHS couldn't have reverted back to baseline previously. The numbers very roughly, we went from something like 5, 6, 7% outpatient appointments delivered digitally up to about 4/5 of them delivered digitally. Our baseline for return is 2/5. And that is what we are targeting by the end of this year. We feel pretty confident that we can get there. The reason for that, for the most part, is I think a lot of the clinicians have actually really enjoyed it. They've recognised that it was actually quite good for their patients. Their patients preferred it. There's a little bit of kickback around primary care that we have seen. For the most part, the kickback is not around should we or should we not. It's just please make sure you provide a choice, because this doesn't work for everyone, and sometimes instead of paradoxically increasing access, you might limit it, particularly certain elderly populations. But as long as we provide the choice, for the most part, people are happy with it. 2/5 we think we are happy with from a net zero perspective, and we work very closely with our outpatient transformation team nationally to make sure we get that balance right.
And just a question from Emily. It's in regards to carbon literacy and health education. What wise words would you have in regards to the work required to educate and upskill health professionals as to the concepts of planetary health, but also in regards to carbon literacy and the delivery of climate sensitive healthcare or transformative healthcare?
No wise words, none at all. I think, and I think I've sort of seen a little bit of this in the UK. When we first go, maybe as an example, when we first go to that digital, when we first go to the outpatient transformation team and we say, hey, we want a net zero outpatient care, they say, great, can you do that for us? And we say, oh, not really. We're not sure that's going to work very well. You guys kind of have to do it for yourself. And they look at us a bit grumpy and they say, oh, fine. And they come back to us with some stuff that is kind of nonsense. And we work with them, and over the course of 6 months together, they build something up that they're actually quite proud of, we're quite proud of, goes far further than we thought, than we had initially planned for it to go. The thing I'm trying to say is they gained their carbon literacy by doing something. They gained their carbon literacy with, really, to be honest, not much from us. We provided some of the parameters of how you might count some of this stuff. We provided some of the rough thinking and some of the connections, a little bit of funding. But for the most part, it was by trying some of this out, getting it wrong 7 times, getting it right the 8th time, and then improving the 9th and 10th that they went forward. I think a lot of it is that. I think a lot of it is giving people the space to have a crack, get it wrong. We have a lot of competitions we're setting up, sort of green ward competitions, where we got a clever app that lets wards register emissions reductions, and then we can verify them, sort of, and compete, which is kind of cool, and gives individual clinicians, wards, and eventually their medical directors, chief executives, the chance to sort of see what this stuff looks like tangibly on the ground. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there's nothing more that people enjoy than a competition, whether it's between health services or
yes,
professional groups, etc. And another question about how has climate action by the health sector influenced wider climate politics and policy in the UK? So how big an influence is the health sector in that debate?
Yeah. No. Who's that? Sally. Hi, Sally. It's hard to answer that, right, with any actual evidence, anything other than some anecdotes. Perhaps the best way I can think about answering that is maybe some anecdotes of recently from the media. When the Prime Minister talks about his 10-point plan ahead of COP26, he proudly and excitedly talks about the work that the NHS is doing. When the Cabinet Office launches its new Climate Champion scheme, the first group they come to is the NHS saying, hey, do you guys have someone? Do you have a chief executive? Do you have a medical director who's really gone and kicked some ass that we could have as one of the UK's climate champions? And when there are floods and heat waves in the same week, which we had last week, the Telegraph, the Daily Mail, the Guardian, but always the Guardian, one of our left-leaning newspapers here, all make the connection immediately between floods, hospitals being overwhelmed, and climate change, and the fact that we need to do more to respond. The reason I'm drawing on those perhaps as examples of how action in the health sector has influenced the broader picture is when someone is talking about this as though it's a great thing, it sort of gives me a sense that maybe they see brownie points in making those connections, and equally when there's something that hits a healthcare service, they see that connection immediately. So I would say increasingly, that certainly those connections would not have been there 2-3 years ago. All of this stuff is relatively new to the United Kingdom. Increasingly, I think Sally is the answer. The other thing to say as well, new chief executive, new secretary of state for health, just over the last couple of weeks for the NHS, big moment of change. One of the very first things the presidents of all 23 of the Royal Medical and Nursing Colleges wrote to both about to ask for was a reaffirmation of the NHS's net zero commitments. So that's not quite national politics, that's medical politics. But there, I guarantee you that letter was important.
It's interesting that the media are actually making those connections now too between those catastrophic weather events and climate change and the health impact. So, Nick, I think that's all we've got time for you today. We really appreciate you after you say having a late night and getting up early. And hopefully you've had a refresher for your Australian accent too by having a chat to us. And I can't believe they have to put subtitles under you. We can still understand you perfectly. So thank you so much for your time. And we really do appreciate you taking the time out of what I know is a busy time for you. So thanks very much. And if you hang on the line, that's cool. Otherwise, if you need to go, that's also for work as well. So.
I will stay as long as I can. Can I just say, I don't know what I want to say. It's maybe thank you to you guys. This stuff is so fantastic. At least the last time I was in Perth, there wasn't going to be this kind of thing coming out of any of Western Australia's hospitals, any of the metro services, north or south. I bet you north has nothing as good as this. Taryn, I saw on the call just before. You know, we talk all the time about, hey, we're not the only ones. Go and look at Washington, DC and what's happening over there with their new health and climate change unit. Go and look down in Perth, Western Australia at the new work being done by the commission, Taryn, that you led. It's so fantastic. It's so exciting, and it's changing so rapidly.
Yeah,
thanks, guys.
You do feel that there's a momentum gathering, which is fantastic. Thanks so much, Nick. That's brilliant. Really good to have you. Our next presentation, and thank you for hanging on, Carol, is from Carol Ben, who may be familiar to many of you as the manager of the Climate and Health Alliance's Sustainable Healthcare Program, which includes coordinating the global green and healthy hospital network in Australia and New Zealand. In April this year, Healthcare Without Harm launched its global roadmap for healthcare decarbonisation, which charts a global healthcare course to zero emissions by 2050 and aligns the health sector with the Paris Agreement. I welcome Carol to tell us more about this initiative and what it means for healthcare providers. Thanks, Carol.
Thanks, Bridget. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me to speak today, Bridget, and for running this fantastic forum. And thank you to Emma and Nick for your fantastic presentations that started with really kind of getting a bit depressing about really taking a focused look at the health impacts of climate change, which we need to do. Thank you, Emma, for providing that. But then thank you so much for Nick for following that up with some positivity on what is happening and providing example of what is possible and what we can do. So I'll just share my slides. Oops. So are you able to see that, Bridget? Is that coming through?
Bridget, you're muted.
You're muted.
Thank you for pointing that out. We're not seeing it just yet, Carol.
Okay. I might try again. Oops.
This is looking promising. There you go.
I didn't press the share button. That is the important step. Okay, so I would like to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the lands that I'm calling in from today. I'm in Melbourne. And I pay my respect to their elders past and present and acknowledge that their sovereignty of this land was never ceded, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So today what I'm going to go through is outlined on the screen just here. I'll start with a quick introduction to Global Green and Healthy Hospitals and the Climate and Health Alliance and Healthcare Without Harm to help give some context about why I'm talking about this global roadmap for healthcare decarbonisation today, and also to let you know about some of the resources and support that is available to help people who are working to improve the sustainability of our healthcare system. Then I'll jump onto the roadmap overview and go through some of the recommendations provided in the roadmap and touch on some actions that you might be able to take on yourself. So Global Green and Healthy Hospitals is a worldwide free collaborative network of health institutions that are working to reduce their environmental footprint and foster a healthy future for people and the planet. There are many, many health institutions and many individuals within health services that are working to improve the sustainability of their service, and they're also realizing that it makes sense to really pool our collective ambition and efforts and work together to do this. So that's one of the things that GGHH provides. We work to facilitate connection between all these sustainability champions within the healthcare sector to support one another and make it so we're not reinventing the wheel all the time and build a community of practice. We also provide tools and resources for members to undertake this work, and I'll touch on those again in a bit more detail in a moment. And we work to document and promote and highlight the successes that members have, both to give recognition for your hard work, but also to show what is possible and to encourage others in the health sector to follow your lead and also take action. Global Green and Healthy Hospitals is based around a framework of 10 interconnected goal areas that you can see on the right of the screen here. So these are all areas where the health sector has environmental impacts, but there's also opportunities to reduce those impacts. And climate change is a major focus within each of these 10 goal areas. Since the network was established in 2012, it has grown substantially. There are many, many members from all over the world. In our region, the Pacific region, which is Australia and New Zealand, there's over, this slide needs to be updated, there's over 110 members representing over 2,000 hospitals and health services, and we're really thrilled that South Metro Health Service is a member along with many other members in WA and throughout Australia and New Zealand, of course. And to explain the logos on the bottom of the screen here, Global Green and Healthy Hospitals is an initiative of Healthcare Without Harm. And Healthcare Without Harm themselves are an international not-for-profit that seek to transform the health sector worldwide without compromising safety, patient safety or care, so that it becomes ecologically sustainable and a leading advocate for environmental health and justice. So Healthcare Without Harm coordinates the GGHH network in different regions of the world from their various regional offices in that part of the world. But because they don't have an office here in Australia, instead, the Climate and Health Alliance, who I work for, coordinates GGHH here in our part of the world. And we do this because CAHI is a strategic partner and affiliate of Healthcare Without Harm. Then the climate and health itself, we're Australia's peak body on climate and health, and our mission is to build a powerful health sector movement for climate action and sustainable healthcare. So our work centres around these 5 areas that you can see on your screen, and our sustainable healthcare work and our GGHH work really fits into pillar 4 here, that the health sector is climate resilient and sustainable. So just really quickly, some of the resources available through GGHH, a lot of them are available to members through an online platform called GGHH Connect. So things like data management tools to help establish baselines and track performance in a few goal areas. There's discussions to help members interact no matter where they are in the world, guidance documents in a few goal areas, and case studies in each of the 10 GGHH goal areas. And those are actually also available open access to anybody from the GGHH website. And then in the Pacific region, we also do some things like run online member meetings and have an email group to help members connect and support one another and yeah, interact with each other and build a community of practice here in our part of the world. And moving on to the roadmap, as Bridget said, this was released in April this year. It's been developed by Healthcare Without Harm along with ARUP, and excuse me, it's been designed as to be a guide for transformational systems change, so that the health sector globally can play its part in achieving a low carbon, just, healthy, and resilient world. And what I'll go through in this presentation is just a snapshot of what's in the roadmap. So I really encourage you to have a look at the full roadmap on the roadmap website, and there's some accompanying resources there that provide more detail as well. Some background for why the roadmap was created. In 2019, Healthcare Without Harm and ARUP put together this report, Healthcare's Climate Footprint, that found that globally, the health sector's footprint makes up 4.4% of total emissions. And also wanted to highlight here that out of those emissions, scope 3 emissions make up the lion's share. So that's the emissions from our supply chain, from the things that health sector purchases and disposes of. And so given these findings, the fact that the health sector is a major contributor to climate change, that climate change affects health, as Emma so starkly highlighted earlier, we really must act to address these emissions, and urgently. So Healthcare Without Harm made a recommendation for the health sector to decarbonise in alignment with the ambition of the Paris Agreement. While simultaneously deploying strategies to achieve resilience and meet global health goals, so such as universal health coverage. And this, this roadmap it's a navigational tool for achieving zero emissions with climate resilience and health equity. It provides high-level guidance on how to get to net zero for the health sector. So it's less specific than the examples that Nick was just sharing with us just now. But it does draw significantly from the experiences of the NHS in its recommendations and what's included in the roadmap. The roadmap, it projects healthcare emission trends into the future and identifies key pathways forward. And really importantly, it shows that we can do this. And also that by doing so, if the health sector charts a course to zero emissions, we can lead by example and really influence and accelerate change in other sectors and other parts of society. And so the main messages of the roadmap are threefold. Firstly, that the health sector must exert its leadership to take action on the climate crisis. That healthcare can and must chart a course to zero emissions in an unequal world, where some hospitals and health services are huge climate polluters and others don't have access to electricity, and some people don't have access to the healthcare they need. So healthcare decarbonisation must contribute to achieving both greater health equity and climate justice. And third, that to get there requires a major transformation of the health sector. So transformation in how health is financed and delivered, transformation of how healthcare goods and services are manufactured and produced and transported and disposed of, and also transformation of broader society's production and consumption of energy and food and goods and services. The roadmap comes with country-specific fact sheets, including one for Australia, and these have been designed to serve as tools for climate and health advocates in different countries, engage policymakers and healthcare leaders to take action. So the fact sheet shows healthcare's the Australian health sector's carbon footprint, highlights the extent to which we can expect this to increase up to 2050, and also highlights the extent to which we can reduce emissions if we put in place the actions in this roadmap. So the roadmap shows some possible healthcare emissions trajectories depending on the actions that that are taken up to 2050. And in the modelling included in the roadmap, the point of departure is the 4.4% of global net emissions that I mentioned earlier that the healthcare sector is responsible for. So what this next graph shows is that growth in emissions from the healthcare sector globally are predicted to increase threefold by 2050 in a business as usual scenario. This next wedge shows what we can expect the emissions from the health sector to decrease by if countries meet the commitments they've set out in their nationally determined contributions. So what this shows is that would be amazing if we do that. But what it also shows that if we do meet at those NDCs, if all countries meet their NDCs, the health sector emissions will still increase. So what this next wedge shows is the additional actions that can be taken across the health sector to reduce emissions further. So this includes, I'll go through these in a bit more detail in the moment, but it covers 3 different pathways that the health sector needs to navigate to reduce emissions, as well as some high impact action areas for the health sector. This last wedge, called Uncharted Territory, shows what we're still going to have to do. So there's this emissions gap left over that isn't modelled. It's not included in this modelling in this roadmap, how we will reduce those emissions. So we're going to have to model, navigate how and think innovatively about how we're going to also bring down these remaining emissions as we're charting our course to a net zero healthcare. One of the key findings of the report was that a dominant source of healthcare emissions is from fossil fuel combustion. And so this includes fossil fuel combustion linked to energy and buildings and transport and materials, including plastics and pharmaceuticals and industrialized agriculture and so on. So it really highlights the importance of taking action to address emissions beyond the hospital walls as well as within the health sector. So the roadmap also recognises that not everyone is starting from the same point. So countries and communities whose health sectors are most responsible for the problem need to take the greatest responsibility in addressing it. And it acknowledges that emissions may need to grow in some low and middle income countries to help achieve universal access to healthcare, and we must do this to ensure greater health equity. And it might not be a surprise to anybody listening in from Australia to know that Australia has been assigned to the yellow trajectory here, which is saying that Australia must take a steep and rapid decline in emissions, and to take aggressive action to really reduce our health sector emissions as soon as we can. Altogether, there's 4 different trajectories based on a country's GDP, and they're they're used as the marker for the starting point for which trajectory a country is assigned to. And what this graph shows is that even with these different trajectories, all countries have to really be closing in on 2050. Closing on net zero emissions by 2050. The roadmap highlights 3 pathways that need to be navigated, as well as 7 high impact action areas, all of which are interrelated and overlapping. So the first pathway that we need to consider in our emissions reduction, and just to is that we need to decarbonize our own operations. So our clinical services and our facilities and our buildings. For instance, through changes to clinical practice and the way buildings are used, and the ways that we segregate and manage waste. The second pathway that needs to be navigated is to decarbonize the health sector's supply chain. And the third pathway is to accelerate decarbonization in the wider society and the wider economy. So we really need other sectors, for example, agriculture and energy and transport, to match the same pace of decarbonization, because each of these sectors influence the health sector's footprint. And the health sector can also help to make this happen by advocating for change beyond the health setting. So now looking more closely at the 7 high impact areas, action areas. This is where they fit within the wedge of the different climate trajectories that I went through earlier. And as I go through the 7 high impact action areas, keep in mind that these are actions that need to occur across each of those 3 pathways I just mentioned. So across healthcare's own operations, across the supply chain, and in wider society and economy as well. So the interventions that make up these actions, when the Healthcare Without Harm team did all the modelling for this, they pulled all these interventions from things like third-party models and published evidence, to test out the scope of and scale of and pace of what was feasible. So all of these actions are based on interventions that are possible and happening now. So the first action area is to power healthcare with 100% clean and renewable energy. So for example, health facilities and suppliers to power their operations through on-site renewables and purchasing renewable energy via the grid. The second high impact action area is to invest in zero emissions buildings and infrastructure. And I'll note here that I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the specific interventions that are included in each of these action areas, because they get quite detailed, but they are all listed on the roadmap website in one of the annexes if you'd like to get that finer detail. So the third action area is transitioning to zero emission sustainable travel and transport. Fourth action area is to provide healthy, sustainably grown food and support climate resilient agriculture. The fifth impact area is to incentivize and produce low carbon pharmaceuticals. The sixth action area is to implement circular healthcare. Or actually, I'm going to take a step back just to provide a bit more detail on the pharmaceutical side of things. This is something that is the health sector's responsibility. No one else is going to deal with the pharmaceutical problem because it is specific to health. So we really need, and this includes acting in this area includes things like thinking about the way medicines are described and really pushing for the manufacture of greener pharmaceuticals and managing pharmaceutical waste efficiently. And so we really need every health professional in the entire health pharmaceutical industry to play a role in this particular action item to reduce the carbon footprint of pharmaceuticals. And in the roadmap, asthma inhalers and emissions from anesthetic gases are identified as hotspots because they are really potent gases, but also because there are clinically sound ways of switching to less harmful products. And it's likely there'll be other examples of being able to do that for other pharmaceuticals in the future. So action item 6 is to implement a circular healthcare and sustainable healthcare waste management. And then lastly, action item 7 is to establish greater health system effectiveness. So we really need to make sure that the money we spend on healthcare actually goes to addressing the right healthcare goals. And so we're not providing wasteful care or unnecessary practice. So the roadmap talks a while about some of the possible ways we can act to bring down those emissions that were included in the last wedge of the graph that show the trajectory of healthcare's emissions. Just one of these is to think of disease prevention as climate prevention. As part of the work of developing this roadmap, the authors investigated how reducing things like tobacco consumption, meat consumption, air pollution, and obesity could contribute to better health outcomes and less emissions. And what they found is that emissions saved from these health interventions could amount to 1.8 gigatons. So interventions like these need to be considered as a serious climate intervention, as well as being a public health intervention. So lastly, the roadmap provides a number of recommendations. To decarbonise, every part of the health sector must follow a trajectory to zero. The recommendations call on governments to set health sector zero emission targets, to create regional decarbonisation roadmaps, along with action plans, and to set regulations and legislation for decarbonisation. The roadmap also calls for bilateral aid and international agencies to invest in climate smart healthcare as part of their COVID recovery spending, their climate finance, and their health development packages. It calls on private health systems, suppliers, and manufacturers to all join in the race to zero emissions. And it was really heartening to hear Nick's stories of how engagement with suppliers is happening in the UK, really heartening. And the roadmap also calls on people working within the health sector to raise our voices to help transform our workplaces, as well as the health sector more broadly and our broader society. So the hospitals and health services everywhere are already doing this work. They're already taking action to deliver low carbon resilient healthcare. And to touch on a few examples from our part of the world, Hunter New England Local Health District have made a commitment to be carbon and general waste neutral by 2030. Ambulance Victoria have announced targets to be net zero emissions by 2045 and have a 2030 target to reduce emissions by 60%. And both Ambulance Victoria and Hunter New England Local Health District have joined something called the Race to Zero, which is a UNFCCC campaign to rally leadership and support from non-state actors from all around the world for delivering a healthy, resilient, and zero carbon future. In our region as well, there's 11 health services, 11 GGHH members who have joined our healthcare climate challenge. So this means they've pledged their commitment to reducing emissions, improving resilience, and demonstrating leadership for climate action. So as well as these really big commitments, there are many examples of work happening, both big and small, to reduce healthcare's emissions and environmental impacts. So I'll end by touching on a few ways people working in the health sector can take action and contribute to decarbonising our health sector. And I'd like to borrow South Metro Health Services phrase that you touched on earlier, Bridget. I really encourage you all to think, act and change. That's a phrase that really encompasses the opportunity for each of us to look around in our areas of work and our spheres of influence at where we might be able to make a difference. We might be able to improve something. We might be able to run a sustainability project. And I really encourage you to seek those out and then have a go at implementing something. And as you're doing so, reach out to other sustainability champions in your network. And you can also look at the GGHH case study library. I've included a link here up on the screen to get some ideas and inspirations of what other members in other parts of the world have done. And I also really encourage you to share what you're doing or what you've done, so others can in turn learn from your experiences, but also so we can help make sustainable healthcare and low carbon healthcare more visible to everybody, and we can help communicate and influence colleagues who aren't quite on this journey with us yet with the positive actions that are happening and are underway. And every action makes a difference, no matter how big or small a project you might run is. Another action to take could be to establish the carbon footprint of your health institution to help understand what your baseline is and know where to focus your efforts and planning for decarbonisation. And GGHH have recently released a carbon footprint tool for healthcare to help in that work for those that don't already have a tool set up to measure their carbon footprint. And there is an accompanying guide with that tool to help demystify the process, particularly for people who are unfamiliar with carbon accounting. And it's really exciting to see that the Western Australian Health Sustainable Development Unit is in the process of getting up and running. And it's also awesome to see that climate mitigation and adaptation are likely to be a major focus of this unit. So I really encourage you all to act on opportunities that might come up to influence the direction that the SDU takes, and particularly to use your voice to advocate for ambitious health sector emissions reduction targets to be set. And lastly, I also really encourage the health professionals among you to use your influence as a trusted messenger to communicate that climate change is a health issue and help progress climate action. And CAHA have recently developed a guide, Real, Urgent and Now, communicating the health impacts of climate change to support health professionals to do this. So that's the second link there on the slide here. So thank you so much, Bridget, for running this symposium and inviting me to speak. And thanks to everybody listening in for taking the time out of your day to join us. And also thank you for all the work that you're doing to help reduce the environmental footprint of your health service.
Thank you, Carol. That's fantastic. And we'll share the slides so you can get access to all of those links, which are really important. And it's really good, I think, for all of us to feel like we're not out there alone, that we're part of a global movement, and all the things that we're all doing will all add up to much greater things globally. I'll move along because we are running a bit short of time and run a little bit over time, but I think everything we've heard has been certainly valuable and worth it. In Western Australia and no doubt across the world, anaesthetists are driving environmental change within operating theatres. The Fiona Stanley Hospital Green Theatres Group was established in 2015 when the hospital first opened and has expanded to include theatres at its sister hospital at Fremantle. So since inception, this group has been instrumental in driving environmental sustainability practice in theatres, from the replacement of single-use plastic items to the introduction of recycling streams for theatre waste. Most significantly, last year, the FSFHG anaesthetic department voted to remove the anaesthetic gas desflurane, which is a volatile greenhouse gas, from all theatres. and is now working with other health service providers for them to do the same, which is really significant. I'll now hand over to Dr. Jennifer Liddell and Dr. Archana Shrivastava from the Green Theatres Group, who have been leading the way and taking action against climate change. Over to you.
Thank you. We'll just share our slides. Great, thanks. I'll borrow the one. Yep, so we're both consultant anaesthetists here in Perth, working across Fiona Stanley and Fremantle hospitals, and working in different capacities within the department on environment sustainability. And just want to acknowledge the countless colleagues that are working with us. So I co-lead the Green Theatre Group with Dr. Adam Crossley, who's working up in the Kimberley at the moment. We've had a lot of support from our department, our executive and colleagues. And Archie will be talking about her projects and is acknowledging the founders of the Trash Foundation and the trainees that have worked along with us on them. And just a quick reiteration on why we are passionate around this, which you really just heard delivered so extensively, but with half of the 7% emissions coming from hospitals and a large amount of that coming from theatres, including waste due to our single-use items and our sterilisation processes, it's clearly a work area that can either contribute really negatively or positively towards the problem. So we wanted to move on that. And just background for us, so we are working across 2 hospitals. We work at Fiona Stanley, which was opened in 2014, very large quaternary level hospital, and I believe the largest anaesthetic department in Australia. And also at Fremantle Hospital, where we have the older building with some reduced services, but still operating there each and every day. And we form a major part of the South Metropolitan Health Service, which itself takes care of 25% of WA's population and is responsible for about 46,000 surgical admissions. And the last point is that we are across 2 hospitals, and in fact they have 2 different systems, with Fiona Stanley being partnered up with Serco that delivers the cleaning and waste, and Fremantle having the more traditional model of in-house staff doing all of that. Both of the hospitals interface with industry partners such as Suez, who handles it beyond our buildings. But the differences mean that our streams are handled differently, and how we can go about recycling and other projects within each hospital is different. So it just adds a level of complexity for us. And a summary on our key achievements and our recommendations, which is what I'll just flick through over the next few slides, being to recommend a multidisciplinary working group right from the get-go, and we have a framework to recommend on that, to link up with colleagues within your hospital and outside of your hospital doing similar work, and share ideas and resources, and ideally link up with executive and gain their support, hopefully leading to a sustainability officer being employed, and we're so grateful for Adrienne and Bridget's work. And then our projects have been around reducing the damaging effects from medications, single-use plastics, drugs in the waterways, trying to reuse and repurpose items, and then where that's all not possible, then trying to recycle as best we can. So our first point, which is often the first recommendation in any inquiry or guideline, is just to take responsibility and recognise that it is a health emergency and that we can lead on it and we can start making changes. Oops. And to start small with whatever might be achievable in your department at that time. So for us, we were really fortunate to realise when Fiona Stanley opened that contracts with Serco already had kind of been costed and approved to deliver recycling. And so Adam and I really started with implementing those recycling streams as soon as we could. And that was working with managers in the waste, cleaning and education areas. But we pretty quickly realised that it was going to be challenging. There's quite a bit of resistance to change and suspicion around, you know, what the benefit was or the outcomes were going to be, concerns around bag handling and whose job it was to do what. So we started to connect in with educators and local champions to work through these questions and dispel rumours and try to put the word out there to do what we can, even in a setting where there is some uncertainty. And we, from that point, made this working group, which I think is just so important when you're a department trying to implement change. So it's important to obviously meet regularly. It's a space where everyone brings ideas that they've heard from all the different symposiums and people they've been talking to, and also can think through what the problems are going to be and how we might go about rolling things out. And this is what ours sort of looks like and what we would suggest, that there's a couple of leaders who are working with representatives from a variety of clinical craft groups. That would include people in all different junior to senior positions. You need to really have facilities management and infection control at the table because they're instrumental for all of this, and ideally some administration support. And then if you do get lucky to have a sustainability officer, obviously having their input and support around that group. We also have, depending on the project, had representation from contracts and procurement, which we've heard is so important. The sterilisation department, which is a big energy and water user, and support from medical illustrations and things like that. Our next point was with the group and some of the streams up and running to look at where we were still creating waste and emissions. We chose to come at it from that hierarchy view of first reduce, then reuse, and then recycle. And we noticed that we were using a single-use non-recyclable anaesthetic tray for every patient, and we wanted to do something about that. We'd heard that Baxter was supporting PVC recycling, and we wanted to get more involved with Fremantle, linking with our colleagues there like Dr. Claire Hinton, and also address residual drug wastage using specialised bins. Just highlighting that the blue trays were the problem. We did an audit of alternatives, costs, and linked in with the infection control staff, and were pleased to find an alternative in the kidney dishes that could be used the appropriate antiseptic wipe and syringe caps to create microenvironments. We took it to the department, got approval for the changeover, and an audit afterwards showed that about 1,500 trays were being diverted from landfill. So that was something we were very pleased with early on. And Dr. Salim Koirati, who was a visiting anaesthetic fellow with us, really took on the PVC recycling, worked again with infection control, waste management, Baxter, and the nursing staff in recovery to get that up and running. And since then, it's been expanded into all the theatres, the endoscopy unit, intensive care has taken it up, and we'll probably see it all through the hospital, ideally, shortly. The next point, really, was to be connecting in with other groups and other people that are working in the same field. So this was around year 4 where we had got to, and another consultant anaesthetist with us, Dr. James Anderson, was linking up with Dr. Chris Mitchell and forming a Green Theatres network. So it became clear that there were Green Theatre groups at a variety of the Perth hospitals, and it would be really beneficial for us to get together, find out what everyone was doing, make sure that we were consistent in our information and what we were achieving. So that's been going from strength to strength, and I think everyone finds it very helpful to be linking together, also linking outwards to organisations like the Doctors for Environment, our college, and things like that. We're also very pleased to link up with Emily, who was our first speaker this afternoon, and just fortunate timing that we were starting to feel saturated in what we could get done at the very moment that executive was really looking to expand sustainability within the health network. So that was fantastic, and we were able to involve ourselves with the Sustainable Health Review and framework, which has ultimately gone on to be endorsed and embedded into our strategic plan. And it gave us a platform to join some colleagues and lobby for employing a sustainability officer, which, you know, it was not difficult. Executive were fantastic and were very supportive. So it wasn't long after that. And I think everyone could see that there was a lot that could be done, that was being done around the hospital, and it just needed that kind of consolidating person, someone who could roll it out and also look at changes at a network level that aren't necessarily a department level. Pictured with Adam and I is Adrienne Were, who was our first sustainability officer, and we're now working so delightfully with Bridget Egan, who's put on today's symposium, and we thank both of them for all of the wonderful work that they've done and the support they've given us. Alongside that, at our department level, once again, we were able to sort of inform and educate the department around the dangers of the greenhouse gas desflurane and the much safer, from an environmental perspective, alternatives that we had available to us. So after some discussion, the department came on board and agreed that it would be much better to stop using desflurane. Logistically as well as environmentally, it was better just to cease it completely. And so that was a big achievement, and I think the first really in Australia, although there's several departments that are moving on this as well now. We're hoping to take a similar approach with nitrous oxide in reviewing its use and reducing its use where we can, because it's another big greenhouse gas. Also on the floor, we had Jay Leonard, who's our operations manager with Serco and works really closely with the Green Theatres group and the Executive Sustainability group. And he championed a Huck Towel recycling project, which partnered up with Paraquad. And that sees Huck Towels that would otherwise get wasted being laundered and distributed and sold, and it provides employment and revenue for people with disabilities that work with Paraquad. And just business as usual. So we're always updating our information guides. We're always trying to present and publish within our department and outside so that we're up to date, we're moving with changes, and ideally people are understanding what to do. It is really quite complicated. We're understanding for our staff that find it can be a cognitive load to know what to do and how to do it. But yeah, we just try and support them as best we can to see the changes. So that is a whistle tour of the 6.5 years that Fiona Stanley has been opened. What we've done, how we've gone about it, and what we would suggest. And alongside that, there's been key work done through the department with trainees, which is what Archie's going to present on.
Thanks, Jen. As Jen outlined, the Green Theatres group has more recently been linked in quite a bit with trainees within the department to grow some of these sustainability initiatives within our trainees. So this kind of sub-talk is entitled Green from the Ground Up, because our trainees are our future. And in starting to think more about environmental sustainability, we have to think about how we're going to continue these practices and patterns of practice into the future. So firstly, why trainees? Trainees are busy people. They've got exams to do, things to learn in specialist training, but they're willing to learn and they're up to date with research most of the time and open to new ideas. They also form in themselves a form of renewable energy. Trainees rotate through departments quite frequently, sort of 3 to 6 monthly, if not more frequently. They also need to complete certain requirements for training, such as research, audit, and quality improvement. They're pretty switched on. They also provide a form of distance seeding of ideas. They rotate through one department, pick up a few things, and take them elsewhere to other hospitals and health service providers. Our trainees are tomorrow's specialists. They're our healthcare leaders of tomorrow. So by starting at the grassroots, our thoughts are that we help to build environmental sustainability and mitigation of climate change into the core business of healthcare. Jen alluded to the SMHS Environmental Sustainability Framework that Emily spoke about earlier on as well. Coming into this fairly late on in the piece as a trainee towards the end of my training, I would look at this and absorb it, but find it fairly confronting to work out how I'd actually apply this to my practice. So my talk's going to focus a little bit more about implementation, especially from the trainee perspective and how we can look to do this across other training specialties as well. In a very timely manner, the college came out with their council's statement on climate change in late 2019, which formally recognised climate change as a health emergency and gave some guidelines for college fellows and for employees of the college to change what they did to help mitigate their impact on the environment. There was also specifically an outcome in the curriculum added to address the environmental impact of anaesthesia and how we could mitigate it. Again, while this provides an academic framework, it doesn't necessarily give us specific ways in which we can change what we do and specifically how to measure these. How do you go from these very broad and helpful statements to actually changing things at the coalface, pardon my pun. So where do you start? As with anything related to trainees, trainee networks, you need to get a trainee team together. And speaking to some of my colleagues when I first came into the sustainability space, there were a lot of people who'd been thinking about environmental sustainability, the impact of what we did, the huge amount of waste produced in healthcare, and how we might go about mitigating some of that. So people are generally motivated, energetic, and passionate, and these were the people who ended up joining the group that was formed. The other thing, training is expensive, both from a time perspective and from a knowledge and energy perspective. So you've got to make sure that there's something in it for trainees. For us, this meant ensuring that some of the quality improvement initiatives that were done could contribute to training requirements and therefore would add value for the trainees. In setting SMART goals and clearly defining the scope, we ensured that things could actually be achieved. So these are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely goals, and ensuring the scope of what we did was manageable with the resources that we had. Getting the college and executive of the hospital on board and using local networks and resources was pivotal in ensuring that the ideas that we had could actually get off the ground. And then actually starting something. We could talk about this for many days, but actually starting a project kind of was the linchpin in getting the group together. The group I'm speaking about here is TRASH, which is the Trainee-Led Research and Audit in Anaesthesia for Sustainability in Healthcare Collaborative. This is a group of trainees founded in 2019 by Dr. Jess Davies and Dr. Sophia Grobler, who were anaesthetic fellows themselves at the time. We're a group of anaesthetic registrars and fellows who are interested in improving the sustainability of anaesthesia and mitigating some of the impact of surgery and the perioperative process on the environment. A lot of us have now moved on to consultant positions, but we remain linked in and we see almost weekly 4 or 5 people join the network, which is fantastic. We're trying to focus on a scientific approach to this because we're scientists, and in order to put forward sustainability initiatives within our health service networks, it does help to actually be able to show outcomes. So by measuring the impact of the environmental impact, of what we do, and then educating and engaging our colleagues in interventions to change these, and then implementing them and measuring the outcomes was our aim from the very beginning. We're not directly associated with or under the governance of ANZCO, although we do ascribe to the information and the policies that they put out. We're self-funded by the sales of cloth scrap caps, donations, and the University of Melbourne, who are very kindly supporting the research database. A key part of Trash was using local resources, and this is where the relationship with the Fiona Stanley Green Theatres Group really allowed Trash and trainee-led initiatives to take off at Fiona Stanley. We had quite enthusiastic collaboration with Green Theatres from the beginning, so thank you so much, Jen and Adam, for coming on board and helping Trash to kind of find a foothold here. Green Theatres were crucial in helping to facilitate linking in with the existing networks that existed, and importantly with the corporate knowledge that already existed behind Green Theatres. So what's come before, what exists, what can be done within this system, what remains to be done, and what can be improved, rather than us having to go back and rehash it all. They also helped a lot in promoting Trash activities and ensuring that the benefits to trainees within the department and management were made very obvious. It's a multidisciplinary group, so this allowed immediate multidisciplinary input and support for Trash projects and initiatives, which was key in some of the projects that we've done so far. And as a result, Trash activities are now integrated into part of Green Theatres' core business and discussed at the Green Theatres meetings. One of the key projects that Trash has been involved in is Operation Cleanup, which is a day of increased awareness of sustainability, environmental impacts of what we do and how we can go about mitigating these throughout the theatre suite. So not just in anaesthesia, but across all the specialties, all the disciplines who work within theatres. In 2020, we focused on reducing bluey use. We chose this as it's simple and innocuous. They're also common, cheap, they're non-biodegradable, unfortunately, take over 100 years to degrade in landfill, and often are inappropriately used. So there's a large amount of waste produced from these items. Across Australia and New Zealand, Trash representatives led a campaign to raise awareness and to brainstorm alternatives or ways in which we could avoid using blueys completely, ensuring that we adhere to the hierarchy of waste management. At Fiona Stanley, through education, advocacy, and the interventions that were brainstormed by our multidisciplinary team, we managed to reduce bluey use in the operating theatre suite by over 10,000 a year, which doesn't seem like a lot, but over multiple years and multiple sites does add up. In 2021, we've expanded the scope of Operation Cleanup to include refusing, reducing, reusing and recycling, specifically refusing desflurane, which we've discussed with regards to its greenhouse impact, reducing bluey use, reusing drug trays, which Green Theatres had already put into place at Fiona Stanley, which was fantastic, and recycling everything that we could where reducing use had not yet had an impact. The results are pending, but what I can tell you is our trainees have been enthusiastically involved in creating resources and helping to educate staff on how we can best segregate our waste, reduce our impact on landfill, and ensure that what can be recycled is appropriately redirected to recycling. And here is Dr. Meredith Cully, who's one of our registrars, with some of the visual resources that she came up with for staff to refer to. Some other Trash activities very briefly include supporting trainees in audit projects such as bluey reduction, recycling and sharp skin use. Some projects that are gaining traction, including the DES-free pledge, PET plastic collection and recycling, social media advocacy, and increasing the awareness of the environmental impact of anaesthesia. And upcoming, we've also got some research projects in the works. And later this year, in November, we've also got our first conference, TrashCon 21. Getting the message out, vitally important. So we've got a website, trash.org, which is administered by members of the Trash Steering Committee, and a Twitter account which is very active. Again, it's administered by the Steering Committee members. We also have regular publications in college publications such as the magazines and e-bulletins and local hospitals, and we're all actively engaging with colleagues at work. So I think this gives a good example how you can go from taking these broad concepts and implementation frameworks and actually utilising who we have and their interests in building this from the ground up within the departments where we work, building the interest and building the motivation to spread this throughout the healthcare service. These are some links to resources for both the WA Green Theatres Network and Trash Collaborative. We're both on Twitter, and we also have websites both in development to help guide people who might be interested. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you to both of you for making the time this afternoon, and just congratulations on everything you've achieved in theatres. It's quite significant and a great example to other areas is what can be achieved with some commitment and that collective action where you get everybody involved and everybody on board. I'm sorry, we've run well over time, and I have to apologise for that. We have got one question, and it's not an easily answered one, about an alternative to blueies in theatre. I think Archie, it was more on the reduction of the use rather than getting rid of them altogether, because that's a difficult one.
It's using all of the principles of refusing, reducing, and we obviously can't recycle them. But what we've suggested instead is really consider whether you need to use a bluey for what it is that you're using. For example, giving a theatre example, sometimes blueys are used to cover arm boards which arms are placed on even though the arm's not being operated on, or to cover a head ring where the head's being placed on even though that's not the site of surgery, simply to keep things clean. We need to consider whether that's actually needed. Can that area be cleaned another way, and is that bluey really needed? Other things include alternatives to blueys, such as if you're using it, for example, to mop up a spill, probably a mop or a paper towel which is discarded and breaks down in landfill might be a better option, rather than using a bluey which is also not designed for that job but also takes a long time to break down and contributes to volume of landfill. Again, this is very site specific, and it took some brainstorming to work out kind of specific alternatives, and it's going to be entirely up to kind of your clinical situation in how you go about working these out. But thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think we'll leave it there. Thank you to all of our speakers who have given such great presentations today and provided so much food for thought and also inspiration to show us all what is possible. And I feel like we are all on the, not just on the same path, but also on making progress on that path. So thank you to everyone for coming along today and being part of this. This is the first of what I hope is many of these presentations. So if you have ideas about speakers or presentations that you would like to hear, please let me know. But thank you again, and thank you for your support of this event. And I'll make the recording available and also share the slides as well. So thank you very much and enjoy your afternoon.
Thanks a lot, Bridget.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
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 Thanks. See ya.